Haight-Ashbury, it became kind of a disorganized situation with no leadership, and trying to keep it afloat where it wouldn't completely disappear, a group of people in Haight that referred to themselves as the Diggers attempted to take the first leadership role in that area. And what they did is they organized what became known in Haight as the Free Store. They organized what became known in Haight as the Free Store. Now, the main objective of the Diggers and the establishment of this Free Store was try to bring the community of Haight together, because you had all kinds of different people there, like we talked about yesterday, right? Rich people, poor people, college graduates, high school dropouts. They had all kinds of people there, and they're trying to put them together because it's just kind of going to pot. Now, what happened is they went to these local businesses and they asked them to donate things that they could put in the Free Store for these people that didn't have much going for themselves, so they could come and get some free things. And the types of things that were donated for the Free Store were clothing, that was pretty common, which would include shoes. They also put together some makeshift lodging. What might that be, makeshift lodging? Might have got some materials, put tents together, or maybe got some wood and built some sort of a shelter, because again it was difficult to find a place for everybody to live. Obviously food was part of the deal, and on occasions you could go there and get a little cash if you needed it. Okay? So this Free Store is put together with the help of the local businesses. They donated items such as clothing, shoes, makeshift lodging, materials, food, and on occasion they had a little stash of money they put aside. They may give you that. What might be a case in which they give somebody money?
Medicine.
There you go, very good. Like if, and it wasn't uncommon for a young lady to have a baby and need some medicine for their sick child, and that's where they may give them money because they obviously couldn't donate medicine. And the reason local businesses contributed, you might think, well, that's weird, I can't imagine they do that, is because they wanted to make these hippies responsible and productive citizens in Haight. They got tired of seeing this, disorganization, lack of effort. So these businesses thought, well, gee whiz, if we do this, there's a good chance that maybe they'll get on their feet and become positive citizens instead of losers, for lack of a better term. Now, what came into Haight that really kind of made this whole vision not work very good? Drugs, very good. The entrance of drugs into Haight screwed this whole thing up. I'm talking with my mouth full, this thing's melting. And these hippies became more dependent on drugs, and they weren't very productive. I got a few. So these hippies became dependent on drugs to the point where what would they beg for in the streets? Not, yeah. What would they do? Money, yeah. They would beg in the streets for money, not ice cream. Now, this really caused some problems. People that were longtime residents of Haight got sick of these no good for nothing drug-taking hippies keep bumming them for money. And it caused worse relations than maybe they had before. So the drug culture into Haight really screwed things up. Hippies became more dependent on drugs. They began to beg in the streets for money, because you obviously couldn't go get drugs at the Free Store. And it caused alienation from the people that were longtime residents of the area. They just got tired. And who else got tired of it when you came to visit Haight? Tourists. Yeah, tourists. They got sick of people begging for money. I hate that. I went to D.C. I didn't see a lot of that, but I've been there before where people were just begging for money all the time. It drives me nuts, like, go get a job. Yeah, I'm sure it was there. Go get a job. I understand one of our guys helped a homeless out by not giving him money, but supplying him with some items. Isn't that right? Yeah, that's good. I did that one time. I went and got a sandwich at Johnny Rockets and gave it to a guy. I didn't give him money, and you could tell by the look on his face that he really appreciated it. Some people, you throw the sandwich away because they want money to buy booze and drugs and whatever. What's that? Yeah. He wasn't happy with me, was he? I gave this guy was begging for money. I went and bought him some jerky. So I can't eat that. I got any teeth. You can gum it. He didn't want jerky. What did he want? Money. Okay. Anyway. These negative impacts on Haight was kind of the beginning of the end for the hippie community, and it kind of ended. The history of Haight would end in an event known as the Summer of Love. It would become the last event of hate, would be the Summer of Love. So again, the negative impacts on hate overturned the positive impacts on hate. It began to be the beginning of the end of the hippie movement there. And the crowning moment, the last thing that ever went on in hate, was called the Summer of Love. And it was simply a summer of celebration completely devoted to pleasure, whatever your definition of that might be. Okay, so the Summer of Love was a summer of celebration that was completely devoted to pleasure. And everybody had a different, some people thought drugs were their pleasure, other people thought other things, as you can imagine. And thousands of people flocked to Haight-Ashbury around the Golden Gate Park and the Golden Gate Bridge that summer. It was a big mass get-together because they knew it would be kind of the last get-together before hate disappeared. So thousands of people flocked into Haight-Ashbury for a summer of celebration completely devoted to pleasure around Golden Gate Park and the Golden Gate Bridge. And they listened to music, and they took drugs, and they made free love, so to speak. And it was a little bit of it was a very liberal summer, I would just say that. And as it ended at the end of the summer, by the fall of 1967, the counterculture in San Francisco had really come to an end, and it never did go back to the way it was at its height. So this Summer of Love was kind of the end of things for Haight-Ashbury. By the fall of 1967, the counterculture movement in San Francisco had come to an end, and as it never was like it was at the height of that popularity. If you go there now, and your mother said she had been there because you're Californian, right? It's just an intersection now, and you can see some remnants probably, but you wouldn't see what you saw in those days. But it's still kind of historically relevant. Okay, that'll take us to a familiar name, I think, probably for most of you, is Woodstock. I actually have an original ticket from Woodstock right there, 1969. It was never used, but it is an original ticket that was sold to get into Woodstock. Now, arguably the most famous event of the 1960s wasn't officially called Woodstock. It was officially called the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair. And that's what it says on that ticket right there, isn't it? Woodstock Music and Art Fair. How much did it cost? You have the price on there? $8. That, $8 is probably like about $75 today. I don't know. So arguably the most famous event of the 1960s was officially called the Woodstock Music and Art Fair. It took place in mid-August of 1969 in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York. The actual date was August 15th, so that is mid-August, okay? So it took place in mid-August on August 15th, 1969. The event was located in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York, B-E-T-H-E-L. So the event took place in mid-August, August 15th of 1969 in the Catskill Mountains near Bethel, New York, B-E-T-H-E-L. Now they estimated, they never had an exact count, but they estimated that more than 500,000 people, along with various musical artists, were in attendance at Woodstock. So this fair was attended by more than 500,000 people, more than 500,000 people, including various musical artists in attendance. Woodstock lasted 3 days with police looking on. Lasted 3 days with police looking on. Now this could have been a little bit of a disaster because the roads going in and out of the mountains were jammed. So once you got in, you were in. And if you never got in, you were out. So once they started piling in here, you were stuck. If you ever get into a place where you park and you got to wait for 4 people to move their car before you can get yours out, I've done that before. That's no good. But when you got 500,000 people jammed in the mountains, and once you're in for a 72-hour period of time, you can imagine there could be some disaster. So the only food and water brought in were what are available or what they brought in. There was no concession stands. So the only food and water that were at Woodstock were those that people brought in. Now, do you always prepare yourself? Okay, you always prepare yourself for the weather and bring in enough food. No, people don't, they never do. So, but this was a deal where you weren't going to, I always say, well, I'll just get something when I get there. There was no place to get anything unless you got it from somebody else. So there's another dangerous possibility, is that the only food and water that were brought in to the concert were what was available. Well, during this time, they enjoyed free music, free drugs, and free love. Free music, free drugs, and free love. Now, it's kind of interesting because despite all of these potential dangers, a lot of them, wasn't there? Despite these potential dangers, you know how many people lost their lives at Woodstock? 0. Not a 1. I know I've got some pictures in here of this. I'm going to look them up so while you write that down. So, participants in Woodstock enjoyed free music, free drugs, and free love. And despite the possible dangers at Woodstock, there were no riots, no violence for the most part, and no deaths. Alrighty, now I know this is a little risky, but you're old enough. Here's an example of how things were at Woodstock. Nobody was too inhibited by themselves at Woodstock. This is pretty normal behavior at Woodstock. Not that it's that great to see, but I think you need to understand that nobody had any problem running around like this at any time during Woodstock. That's kind of how it was. And this is an idea of what Woodstock looked like. The number of people that were there. And you can see, well, they got something over their heads because what did it start to do at Woodstock? Rain. Rained pretty good, actually. So the roads were muddy going in and out. It was quite a fiasco. But I think people enjoyed themselves and nobody killed. This is just a picture of Janis Joplin right here, who performed at Woodstock. Who is kind of the one that is most known for his famous rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock? Anybody know that? That boy, Jimi Hendrix is right. You didn't even have to go to your grandparents for that one. Jimi Hendrix, that is exactly correct. But Woodstock was an event. When I was teaching at Minico High School in Rupert, Idaho many years ago, I had a really good friend of mine who was an English teacher who was at Woodstock. And so he would come in and talk to kids because he was there. And it was kind of an interesting scenario. Okay, any questions on Woodstock? Now this is what I think is really important to talk about, is the dangers of the counterculture movement. What were the dangers of this hippie movement in America? Did it cause us any problems that we still inherit today? Well, we'll get to that, okay? So what were the dangers of the counterculture? I'm going to give you 3 reasons why the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in American history. And I want you to listen to these, and I want you to think in your mind, are any of these problems that resulted in the counterculture movement still problems today? Because they were initiated then. We still deal with them. The first example of how dangerous the counterculture movement was in America during the 1960s was it promoted self-destruction. It promoted self-destruction. And I'm going to give you an example on that. Okay? It promoted self-destruction. What does that mean, Ivan? It promoted self-destruction. Well, yeah, and then if you rewrite it, what happened to you?
You get hurt and go to jail.
Okay, what else?
Drugs.
Yeah, and how do drugs promote self-destruction?
Overdose.
There you go. Here's the example. Many young lives were either lost or ruined as a result of the counterculture movement in the 1960s. Many young lives were either lost or ruined as a result of the counterculture movement. We have some close friends right here in this town who had to go to Haight-Ashbury and get their daughter because she was such a mess during the 1960s, and she never really recovered that well, and still today struggles, probably because of that experience. They had to drive to San Francisco and get her out of Haight-Ashbury before they found her what? Dead. Brought her back, tried to get her lined out, still struggles. Okay, so that's an example. The second example, or second reason, not example, excuse me, the second reason that the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in American history is it increased social hostility across the United States. It increased social hostility across the United States. Okay, what do I mean by that, Morgan? It increased social hostility across the United States. What is social hostility? Hostility between social classes. Very good. So what began when all of a sudden this counterculture became a problem? Whose fault is it? Well, it was the damn lower class. Oh, by God, it was not. It was the middle class. No, those dang entitled upper class kids. No, it's the middle upper class kids. No, it was those lower class kids. Everybody blamed each other. Who is the only social class that can take no responsibility? No, the upper middle class were the ones that were involved. Who's the only social class that they say, I had nothing to do with this and be right? Lower. But who gets blamed for this? The lower class. They were the only one that could say I had nothing to do with this. But normally they got blamed for it. So the problems of the counterculture resulted in finger-pointing between social classes. Who's at fault for the counterculture movement? Each social class blamed each other. And in reality, the only social class that didn't have their fingerprints on the counterculture movement were the lower class, who most people would say were responsible for the whole thing, which they were not. And finally, this is the most important reason, in my mind, that the counterculture movement in America was a dangerous time in American history. It was simply bad in view of human nature. It was simply bad in view of human nature. It was simply bad in view of human nature. What do I mean by that, Jared? It was bad in, what's the view of human nature? What's my view of human nature in this class? Good kids, study pretty hard, take notes most of the time. But if all of a sudden you kids came in here and gave me the finger and told me you weren't taking any notes and you hated this class and you kicked over the video recorder when you left, would that be bad in view of what I'm used to? So the point is, these things that these kids were doing were not normal in social acceptability at the time. Now think about this. Problems in society today, in my mind, were actually created as a result of the counterculture movement. What would be an example of that we've talked about? What happened in the counterculture movement are we still talking about today? What problems have we inherited that they didn't have prior to the counterculture movement? Okay. Are people still on drugs?
Yeah.
Do you think that has anything to do with how prevalent they were in the 60s? No. Marijuana, my God, it's made a comeback, okay? 60s, it was big. When I was in high school in the 70s and college in the late 70s, it had slowed down a little, but it was still pretty big. Kind of went, I started teaching in the 80s. There was a little bit of marijuana in the 80s. I remember it as a teacher, kids then it kind of cooled off in the 90s. And early part of the 2000s, and all of a sudden we are back at it. Heroin, huge drug in the 60s. Huge drug. Janis Joplin died of a bad heroin overdose. Never even heard about heroin for 30 years. Big deal. In this town, it's a big deal. So I think that that's an example. Certainly drugs, okay? How about education? What are the views on education today in comparison to 1958? I think the views on education are awful. I mean, I think your parents value education a ton. But I've been teaching 38 years. I've seen it all, right? I can remember calling a mother because she couldn't get her second grade daughter to school on time because she worked in a casino and never got home until late, and then had 4 or 5 different guys that she was seeing at the same time. And I wondered why. You think I'm going to yell at the second grade girl because she doesn't get to school on time? I'm going to yell at the mother. And she tried to negotiate me when I called and were nice to her, and finally I didn't get nice because I can get that way. And I said, you are younger, ma'am, than my youngest son. If you think I'm listening to one excuse you have, I am not. I said, your daughter's got to start coming to school, or I'm going to call the Department of Family Services and turn you in for neglect. Because I don't want her chastised for coming to school late every day. You think that's kind of what started in the 60s? Single mother, 4 or 5 guys she's with, commune style, so to speak. And who's suffering? Kids. Okay? Another example. Okay? So education is a tough deal too. People, you know, even government. In 1958, if the President of the United States said something, it was gospel. I mean, that's the way it was. The respect for the office of the presidency, when did it diminish? Really, when did it diminish? What event? We just studied the Vietnam War. Okay? Since the Vietnam War, do people question going into the service? They do. In the old days, we just talked about World War I. If you can remember this, you probably can't, but it's a long time ago. But do you remember when Woodrow Wilson asked for he didn't ask for volunteers, he enacted the draft? 10 million guys signed up for the draft. 10 million, didn't even question it. Didn't even question it. Talking about today, 116,516 soldiers, American soldiers, lost their life in World War II, or World War